Welcome to Fourth and State. I'm David Haynes, the opinions editor at the Milwaukee journal Sentinel. Climate negotiators are meeting in a giant conference yet this week near Paris to hammer out a deal that would commit nearly every nation to taking steps to reduce global warming. Now, I wrote a column about this last week. Here's what I wrote. Climate change is real, and humans are responsible. This is not debatable if you believe in science. Well, a lot of you thought it was debatable, and you debated it with me. Now, there's nothing wrong with sharp differences. American politics is often rough and tumble, and that's usually a very good thing. We want it that way. But lately, we've gone way beyond sharp differences, and we've gotten into something else. We often, too often I think, navigate the world with a different set of facts. In this debate, we have climate scientists on one side, the people who have spent years observing and studying this problem. The vast majority of them say that humans are responsible for global warming. That's a fact. On the other side are opponents, often using a completely different set of facts. And no surprise, they come to completely different conclusions. Donald Trump says flatly, I don't believe in climate change. Ted Cruz, the Texas senator, he's from oil country, says climate change is not science, it's a religion. Statements like these, though, can be music to the ears of deep-pocketed donors, often with ties to the oil and gas industry. So my advice is know your sources and their biases. So today we're going to try to begin to set the record straight. You can join this discussion on Twitter. Please use the hashtag MJSClimate. Now I'd like to welcome Jonathan Martin to this discussion. John is a professor of atmospheric and oceanic sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He joined the faculty in 1994. John is one of the weather guys. You may have heard him on Wisconsin Public Radio. John Martin, welcome to Fourth and State.
Thank you, Dave. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for being with us. Let's begin with this statement, and it ought to sound familiar. Climate change is real, and humans are responsible. True or false?
That is true, Dave. Climate change is real. The globe's average temperature is warming, and human beings have made a substantial contribution to that warming through our increasing use of fossil fuels over the last 150 or so years. And the primary byproduct of that combustion of oil and gas is carbon dioxide, which is one of several gases in our atmosphere that have the property of being transparent to incoming radiation from the sun, which warms us up, but being semi-opaque to the outgoing radiation, which is in the infrared wavelengths, that the Earth and everything on it, including ourselves, emits back to space. So the retention of this infrared energy, made possible by the presence of gases such as carbon dioxide, and the increases in the carbon dioxide fraction are responsible for the increases in the average temperature of the planet.
All right, so we've heard from a number of readers who have asked similar questions. We also published a commentary this morning by Joseph Bast. He's the president of the Heartland Institute in Chicago. That's a conservative think tank that he operates. Mr. Bast has written extensively about climate change. He does not have a background in climate science. But he wrote in his commentary this morning, quote, the impact of humans on the climate is tiny compared with natural variability. Is that true?
No, it's not true. I think the impact of human beings on weather systems is tiny compared to the natural variability. We don't have any control over the parade of weather systems that will or will not bring any snow, perhaps this winter as an example, over southern Wisconsin. We have no control over that. However, Mr. Bast's organization, famous for its intentional obfuscation of the evidence, is overstating the case there. There's absolutely contrary evidence that we do, in fact, have a substantial impact on the climate. The current carbon dioxide fraction in the Earth's atmosphere is approaching 400 parts per million. So that means 400 molecules of carbon dioxide for every million molecules collected in a sample. That is far in excess of anything that the Earth's atmosphere has experienced, at least in the last 2 million years. And that increase has occurred exactly in lockstep with the burning of fossil fuels, the oxidation of fossil fuels, which incidentally, we've had a slight reduction in the reservoir of our molecular oxygen, O2, which you and I breathe to stay alive. That's exactly in proportion to the burning of the fossil fuels that have been sold and marketed across the world as part of a global enterprise. So the accounting on what we've used and what we've extracted is very exact. And so it's really nice to be able to put these pieces of the puzzle together. And one comes to the conclusion that the increase in carbon dioxide that is driving the current warming is definitely a function of the combustion of oil and gas in the industrial world in the last 100 or so years.
And so let me ask you a question about the consensus here. We often hear that most scientists who have examined it, and the number you always hear is 97%, that's based on several studies in the past decade or so, agree that climate change is real and humans are causing it. Is this debate over?
I think the debate about the science is absolutely over. I mean, there's no question that all of the evidence that we've gathered about not only the physical mechanisms that might be driving the increase in the global temperature, as well as manifestations of the change in global temperature in a variety of different data streams, all point in the same direction. And so, in science, one can never say unequivocally that an answer is in and won't be changed. However, it is not fair to suggest that the skeptics on this issue have as much hand in their sense of what the reality is, as do the 97, 98, 99% of people who have spent their lives thinking about these issues have in saying that, yeah, we believe the science is now in.
And you're not saying don't continue to study it.
No, not at all. I mean, there's all sorts of things that people need to study. We need to understand all kinds of smaller and smaller and more detailed interactions the climate system might have with the biosphere, with water and air resources independent of global warming. Those are all important things to study. But the broad question of whether or not the planet's warming and whether or not human beings have had a hand in warming at this time is pretty strongly concluded.
All right, let's go to our first question from Twitter. And again, that hashtag is MJS Climate. We're hearing from a reader who wants to know, where does Wisconsin rank in severity of climate change? And how are we doing in terms of preparing for it?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how one ranks the severity of changes in one location versus another. I know there are certain different risks that different locations on the globe face. A lot of the island nations in the Pacific Ocean, Central Pacific Ocean, with sea level rise, they have a really substantial impact that might not be that far off, where they start to lose substantial amounts of the territory that make up their island. Here in Wisconsin, we have slight changes in the temperature to water of streams and rivers, which of course funds a lot of our tourism because there's fishing in those places, and these species of fish are very sensitive to slight changes in the temperature of the water for spawning and for various other means of survival. So I don't really know if I have a clear, definitive answer. I can tell you, though, that there's a great organization on our campus that has involved a variety of different people from all kinds of different institutes around the globe. We have people from the DNR, we have people from the Department of Tourism, we have people from departments across campus. It's what's known as the Wisconsin Institute for Climate Impacts Initiative. And they're trying to determine exactly what the detailed catalog of those impacts are for the state of Wisconsin. The idea being that if we know that better and we have that really quantified and put into some really concrete terms, that will better inform the decisions that public policymakers make in order to try and ameliorate some of those impacts.
And I know that Aldo Leopold did some observations 60, 70 years ago that are now being compared in terms of when certain plants up north bloom, and there's been some discoveries that some of those plants are blooming earlier, as much as a week or two earlier. I want to go to a question I got via email from a man in Milwaukee this morning. And he says that it's important for all of us, I pointed this out in the opening, to know the biases of people who are making statements on climate change. Mm-hmm. So he wants to know if you have biases. He wants to know who's funding your research, and is that something we ought to be considering with climate scientists? And I should say, you're a weather scientist. I misspoke earlier. That's a more accurate way to portray what you do.
Yeah, if one looks at the whole 25 years of my professional career, I've spent more time doing research on weather systems in the middle latitudes where we live than I have on research issues directly related to the climate system. Although in the last 5 to 6 years, I've certainly been moving towards a broader perspective and a climate perspective. And it's also safe for me to say that when one is in my field, broad field of atmospheric and oceanic sciences, it's impossible to not be forced to learn about the climate system and about the impact that your own specialty has on the climate system broadly. So I have some understanding of how weather systems impact the climate system and vice versa. But it's my research funding comes from the National Science Foundation, and it's part of a very competitive process by which, in which a person writes a proposal, spends several months putting it together. It's 15 pages long. You have to get all of the statements that you about your prior work that's been funded by the foundation. They're not going to look favorably upon a subsequent proposal if you haven't been able to produce some new research insights based on your old one. And then you have to outline a 3 or sometimes a 4-year plan for research that will involve graduate students. You have to identify the projects that those graduate students will work on. And then all of that is submitted to very intense scrutiny by peers. You don't know who they are. And they know who you are, but you don't know who they are. And there's 5 people to review that at a minimum, sometimes much more than that. And then they come back and they rate your proposal. And if it isn't excellent, there's 5 categories, the best one's excellent. And I can tell you that in the current climate of funding, federal government spending on scientific research, if you don't get 5 excellent reviews, you don't get funded on that. And you're back to the drawing board trying to come up with another set of ideas that you might be able to set out there. The success rate is about 1 in 6 for these proposal submissions. So in order to maintain a research group that's constantly creating new insights about nature, you have to be spending an enormous amount of time expecting failure. You're worse than the best. You're worse than the worst hitter in the major leagues in terms of your batting average. But you got to keep going to the plate.
So it's hardly a slam dunk.
It's not a slam dunk. And this notion that if you write the word climate in a proposal, which I know a lot of people have, that it will magically be funded is utter nonsense.
So another question from a reader. This reader says, the U.S. has already done a lot to improve the environment, but China and India haven't. So why should we do more now, coming out of whatever happens at the climate conference in Paris, when India and China are a mess, frankly, with all the air pollution?
I think the sentiment that underlies that question is one that's very worthy of consideration. I think the prior agreement, I think it was made in 1991, the Kyoto Protocol, which never got approved by our United States Senate. I think that was one of the really bad problems about that agreement, was that some of the industrializing nations like India and China were not required to come to the table, even after a reasonable amount of time in which their economies might be able to have caught up and then readdress, their contributions to global emissions. So I hope that what comes out of Paris actually does put at least a timeline on when those countries have to also get themselves into the fold in terms of trying to help the whole globe clean up its act. So I definitely agree with that sentiment from the reader. However, I'll say this, even in the absence of a direct or a very short-term requirement for those countries to come back to the table and renegotiate their contributions, it's in our best interest as a country to put restrictions on our own emissions, because I think that will spur the innovation required for the development of alternative energies. And I would much prefer, and energy strategies, I'd much prefer that the United States gets to the finish line on that challenge, because it's a global challenge. Somebody's going to become the purveyor of the next generation energy around the world. I would much rather be the seller than the customer as a citizen of the United States. So I think that we should never be thinking about this problem as so complicated and so complex that we in the United States, with our great American ingenuity, our great American universities, cannot meet that challenge. This is a can't-do attitude, and we've never had a can't-do attitude in the United States. Why should we start having one now?
So another reader wants to know, and there's been this controversy in the last couple of years about scientists who may have fudged their data or fiddled with their data. And the reader wants to know, so can we really believe them if that's happening?
I think that this is a bit of a myth that's been propagated by those who want to discredit climate science in general, especially with regard to its conclusions about global warming. I don't doubt that there's a few shady characters in the broad population of people thinking about these issues, and that some of them may have been less than transparent about some of their methods and maybe even some of their conclusions. However, that kind of misconduct simply cannot produce a consensus. And that's because the peer review process in science is fiercely critical. Every time one submits a paper, even if it's right, you're going to get people immediately, since the ideas are not theirs, the reviewers are going to be immediately suspicious that you've done something wrong. And so that paper is going to be forced to go through a time-consuming revision and a reevaluation. So I think the possibility that systematic misconduct can get through that filter, which is, as I say, extraordinarily fierce and anti-competition, in that sense, I mean, they're looking at the competition of another scientist and saying, I don't want this person's work to get out before mine does. That's not just not going to hold water. You're not going to be able to sustain some sort of systematic misconduct.
So a couple of the readers said that there's evidence they've read that the Antarctic ice is actually thickening. How does that square with this idea of global warming?
One of the consequences of a global increase in the temperature is that there's going to be an increase in the amount of water vapor that the atmosphere can hold at any one instant. And so I don't know the answer exactly about this problem in Antarctica. It's a very vexing problem, but it points out two things for me. One of them is, first, with more water vapor in the atmosphere, as the planet warms a little bit, I think that means that places that historically are dry, including Antarctica, the very high latitudes of the southern hemisphere, it doesn't snow very much there each year historically. With a little more water vapor, it may snow just a little bit more, and that may be enough to offset what could otherwise what one might otherwise expect would be a decrease in the ice. So we might be accumulating more snow at those high latitudes than we have in the last 50 or so years. We've got an instrumented network of observations. Actually, it started here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison on the Antarctic continent. And so we're going to be able to start compiling data about storms and snowfall increases if they're occurring. So that's one thing that might be going on. To base one's opinion on one particular piece of evidence is not a particularly scientific way to do it. One has to try and account for as comprehensive a set of observations as possible. So to conclude that global warming can't be happening because there's a little bit of increased ice and snowfall at high latitudes in the southern hemisphere is really not a comprehensive view of the problem.
So likewise, I heard Ted Cruz say the other day that for the last 18 years, I don't know where this fact came from, but for the last 18 years, we haven't really noticed an increase in global temperatures. One, I'm not sure that's accurate, but even if it was, what I hear you saying is that's one factor. There are a lot of factors to consider here.
Well, that's true. First of all, I think that is a false statement. That's something that's been, we were just talking about this the other day, a couple of colleagues of mine and I. Where did this so-called global warming hiatus myth come from? I don't really know where it came from. I've recently been able to navigate a paper through for publication where I looked at a really simple analysis of how big does the cold air pool in the lower troposphere get in the northern hemisphere during the winter time for the last 66 years. So I got a 66-year time series, and it's systematically shrunk in that 66-year time period. And that's just based on a couple of different data sets. So it's not cherry picking one data set only. And the interesting thing about that is that there's absolutely no last 19 year hiatus in that shrinking, which would only be the case if the global warming had stopped in the last 19 years. So that's kind of crazy. Another interesting point about that, to avoid the cherry picking issue, is that the two winters with the smallest cold pool area in the last 66 years were the last two, 2013, 14, and 14, 15, which all of us in Wisconsin know were pretty cold winters locally. Right. But northern hemisphere wide, they were the warmest ever by this measure. So it's easy to be fooled by your locality about what's going on in a global sense.
Right. So let's go back to Twitter. Again, that hashtag is MJSClimate. This is from Mike. He wants to know, to what extent are humans responsible for the recent warming? I had this question from others, including some skeptics who say, we don't know what percentage humans are responsible, so therefore, how can we justify spending what could be billions of dollars to ameliorate this?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's definitely a worthwhile question. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has put out its 5th assessment report at the turn of the year 2013 into 2014, has, each time it's made an assessment report, it's made a statement that addresses that issue. And the most recent one said, quote, "It's extremely likely that human activity has been the dominant cause of global warming in the last 60 or so years." And I should point out that this adverbial phrase, extremely likely, was the result of endless debate among bunch of people thinking about what should it mean, and I'm glad I wasn't on that committee, but extremely likely was a carefully chosen descriptor that indicates a probability of 95 to 100% certainty based on an expert assessment of all available evidence. So that's a very strong statement. I don't have the time to tell you what the first, second, third, and fourth assessment statements along this line were, but each time it's gotten more and more definitive. And it began with a bland statement along the lines of, there's reason to suspect that human activity has had a role in the last 50 years of global warming or so. And that was issued in the early 1990s. So continued research, continued thinking about this, continued new ways of examining the problem have led to increased certainty. This is over 1,000 scientists globally working on this problem, and they have to come to a consensus before the document goes out. So this is not an easy thing to concoct unless the evidence is overwhelming.
Another reader wonders if you've looked at the global temperatures that NASA's Goddard Institute has plotted, and this reader says that to him what they show is that the average global temperature rose during the first third of the century when there was a lot less fossil fuels in the air. And so I think what he's saying essentially is, look, how do we know that fossil fuels are the real cause when this was happening anyway, when we were putting a lot fewer of them into the atmosphere?
Well, I don't think the evidence that's quoted there suggests that there was warming occurring when we weren't putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere. Maybe the reader means somewhere from 1900 to 1920, I guess, where there were fewer automobiles. That's fair. So there may well be some suggestion there. But carbon dioxide addition is only one factor that figures into the whole change in temperature, global average temperature of the planet. One of the biggest unknowns in our current thinking about this issue is the role of aerosols in the atmosphere. And aerosols are very tiny particles that might come out of factory smokestacks and various other things. Some of them are naturally occurring. They come from either forest fires or even some gas to particle conversions that occur in the atmosphere. But it's believed that these aerosols, at least the human produced ones that are sulfurous in nature, can provide a shade to the atmosphere for incoming solar radiation. And that might reduce the global temperature. And to the extent that these aerosols are a product of increased pollution in industrializing countries like China and India, it may just be that their presence has grown in the last half of the century to the point where some of those impacts have been competing against the increase in carbon dioxide. And that when one figures out all of the different factors and you see what settles out, you can end up seeing some variation in the trends of the global temperature. It's not, no one has the expectation that it ought to be a systematic increase year after year. It'll be such on a long-term average, but not maybe year to year.
So again, what I hear you saying is that this is complicated and you have to consider a lot of factors, not cherry pick one or two to make your case. So here's a question from another reader on Twitter. And this reader wants to know, is there any hope of stopping or delaying global warming, or is the die cast?
Well, I think that's a good question first. I think that's a very good question. I don't agree when people will say something along the lines of the planet is at risk. The planet's not at risk. This planet has gone through an awful lot worse in the past. It's been hit by giant asteroids. It's killed almost everything on the planet, some of these instances. Our civilization and what we need to provide for that civilization is indeed at risk. And so that doesn't take a very big perturbation, a very big change from the conditions that we're already used to start having a big impact. If you start to have drought conditions that are extended in locations that don't usually have extended droughts, and in some of those, let's say if they coincide with the central breadbasket of North America, the world's got problems. There may be other such issues. So I think that it's probably fair to say that we're probably not going to be in a catastrophic situation in the short term, but we can do something about mitigating what we're doing to the atmosphere. That's why understanding what we've already done and coming squarely to terms with it is the first step towards mitigation and figuring out what's our longer term strategy. I think there is a little bit of an element of continued temperature increases already baked into the cake, given how much carbon dioxide has already been placed in the atmosphere. It's imperative to start making a change to that now if we want to start peeling back some of that warming and thereby forestalling or maybe even avoiding entirely some of the consequences that might occur for human civilization in the next 50 to 100 years.
So back to Twitter, another reader wants to know, so what can we do to help explain this complicated topic to the average citizen? I think as we've seen, and this is me speaking, it's pretty easy to demagogue this issue. What can we do to counter that, John?
Boy, I wish I knew. That's a $1 million question. I really wish I knew that. I've tried, and so has Steve, through the Weather Guys and other outlets, and a lot of my colleagues have as well. We really tried to be sober about this subject. I know there's a lot of noise on both sides. So there's noise on the extreme, the sky is falling side, and there's noise on the side where don't worry about this at all, it's not an issue. Somewhere in the middle is certainly where I think most people would agree. And the question is, how do you get as many people as possible into that middle, which is going to be the actionable middle, what we're going to be able to do something about? I think that some of the strategies involve using very clear examples of changes that maybe people in their own lifetimes can see, even if they haven't noticed them. I think, for instance, this recent study I had out, I think is a really simple demonstration to people that there's something going on. It turns out to be a really neat result that I think I can explain to people in a fairly simple, straightforward manner. And that at least invites conversation about the prospect, if you're a skeptic, that something's going on. And I would settle just for that, that people have a mind open enough to trust that the scientists are not in this game to, like some of the skeptics say, to promote a lavish lifestyle. What scientist do you know has a lavish lifestyle? I don't have one.
I don't know any who do.
Yeah, I don't aspire for that, but I want people to pay attention to hard-won knowledge.
Yeah. So one last question. This comes from Katie in Milwaukee, and it brings it home. So I'd like you to answer this. What are some of the quick and easy changes that all of us could make in our daily lives to reduce carbon footprint?
Well, that's a good question. There's probably a wide-ranging set of answers. One that reminds me of the 1970s when we had the OPEC crisis was just turn the lights off. Simple things like that. Try to adopt the discipline, if you don't already have it, of turning the lights off. Maybe lowering the temperature in your house if you can stand it a little bit in the evening. Then there are opportunities. I think this is a revolution that's going to be perhaps initiated by people of means. I think people of means who have the opportunity to make a selection about what vehicle they drive. Maybe if they can bias those selections towards fuel-efficient vehicles. Maybe if we can open up markets for electric vehicles, we can think of some other alternative ways to get ourselves around. If we can maybe begin to adopt some more mass transit strategies, things like that. They all seem to have this sense of the government coming in and telling you what to do, and that immediately turns people off. But I think if people reconceive this problem as one of, we as a community can make a collective, aggressive move to curtail what I think is coming, that might be the way for us to envision this as a new sort of space program, as a new sort of fight against fascism, whatever you want to do, whatever analogy you want to use. Collectively, the United States has got much more power to make a change than it's currently enacting. And I think we can find our way back to a community view of how to solve this problem. But I think it will start with people of means.
So it may be at the grassroots. Well, John, we'll have to leave it there. John, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much, David. I certainly appreciate the opportunity.
That was John Martin. He's a weather scientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. A reminder, you can continue this discussion right now on Twitter and Facebook. Just keep using that hashtag MJSClimate. And we'll archive this show on our website. Finally, I've got some homework for you. Get the facts. Advocate for thoughtful, smart solutions. Let's demand that Democrat and Republican alike do their jobs. Let's move away from this comic book debate that is nothing more than a caricature of the issues involved, which are real and important. Let's get to the real question. What should we do about climate change? That's the question that matters. Thanks for watching. I'm David D. Haynes for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel.